Hello everyone, my name is Nicola Laurent and I'm the current president of the Australian Society of Archivists, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on Blue Shield Australia. Before we begin, we will start with the ASA's acknowledgement of country. The Australian Society of Archivists acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from across Australia and the surrounding seas and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, culture and community. Particularly, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, whose lands I'm joining you from today. We pay our respects to the elders past and present. We honour your local community traditions of caring for archives and culture through country, through songs and stories. This webinar will begin with a presentation before opening up for Q&A. You have buttons down the bottom for the Q&A, so please ask your questions here. There's also the chat function that you can use and also a live transcription button. If you want to turn that on or off, you can get closed captioning. So now let me introduce you to our two presenters. We have Kathryn Dan. Kathryn is one of the two ASA representatives and incoming chair of Blue Shield Australia Committee. Kathryn is the University Archivist at the Australian National University and manages archives, records and FOI programs. She is also a past president of the ASA. Kathryn Robinson is one of the two ASA representatives on the Blue Shield Australia Committee and has a keen interest in protecting cultural heritage. Kathryn is a Senior Project Officer, Record Keeping Standards and Advice at New South Wales State Archives and Records, and is involved in regulating and monitoring record keeping in New South Wales Government. Kathryn is one of our Amanda Jones judges and is a past president of the ASA. I think there's a sign here. I think maybe I will become a Blue Shield Australia representative in my future. I'm liking it. But thank you both for joining us today. I'll now hand it over to you both to get the presentation underway so we can all learn more about Blue Shield Australia. Thank you both.
Thanks, Nicola. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I'm just going to share my screen. So the way this will run today, we have a few slides to give a bit of an introduction. Then Kathryn and I have a bit of a chat, some questions that might be in your mind, and then we're happy to go to a Q&A and answer any questions that you may have or to have some discussion. So can everybody see that? Hopefully that has worked and you can see my screen and the slides that we'll show. So we're just going to cover a bit of the how, what and why of Blue Shield, Blue Shield Australia and Blue Shield International, and a little bit about the activities that are undertaken. So 2021 is the 25th anniversary of, let me just see if I can move that on, is the 25th anniversary of the Blue Shield organisation. So it has been around for a little while. In 1996, 4 pillar or founding organisations, non-governmental organisations, met to coordinate the formation of a new organisation that was concerned with the protection of cultural heritage. So those non-governmental organisations came from different sectors that deal with cultural property of different kinds. ICA, the International Council on Archives, is the one most familiar to us, our international organisation for archivists, but also the International Federation of Library Associations, IFLA, ICOM, which is the International Council of Museums, and ICOMOS, the International Committee on Monuments and Sites. They were the 4 founding organisations. The Blue Shield emblem and the organisation are based on international conventions. So there's a relationship with the UN and particularly with UNESCO. And the sort of founding document for work is the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. So that emblem developed by UNESCO is used internationally to indicate protection of cultural heritage, whether that's sites, museums, objects, documentary heritage, or collections in museums, libraries, archives, etc. The origins of that convention and Blue Shield work is really about that armed conflict concept. So the convention arose from widespread destruction from all sides in the Second World War, and the need to prevent a repeat of that sort of destruction. So it's an international treaty, and it seeks to protect cultural heritage during war and military occupation. The film Monuments Men, some years ago, if you saw that, sort of shows in a fictional kind of way some of the origins of that move to establish the convention. It's the oldest international agreement that actually addresses issues of cultural heritage preservation. Australia ratified the 1954 convention in 1984, so we have signed up to that. But we're not a signatory to two protocols that relate to the convention. And that's something that Blue Shield would eventually like to advocate to change, because those two conventions actually extend what's in the Hague Convention, give it a little more body and specificity, but also talk much more about other emergency sorts of situations, which tends to be what is much more relevant in this part of the world, natural disasters. So that's just a slide of the team that was sort of part of the origin of this sort of cultural heritage protection work. And you can see on the left there some of the things that were done actually during World War II to say, you know, this is cultural property which should not be destroyed. And then more modern uses of the Blue Shield. So Blue Shield International is made up of representatives from those founding partners and other organisations that have a commitment to protection of cultural heritage and cultural property. Blue Shield International gives a sort of an umbrella governance for what we do in Australia. It's international, independent, professional, has a professional basis in the different sectors. And so it brings together knowledge, experience, and those sorts of networks of experts to deal with cultural heritage. As an entity, it's advised, assisted, and investigated what was happening in various events. For example, war in Iraq, the tsunami in 2004, Haiti, the Beirut explosion in 2020. So sometimes there are people on the ground. Often it is more about communication. But the focus of Blue Shield is often very much focused on preparation, on sort of preparatory advice and training, and sometimes on response, but very much working with whatever is happening with other local bodies or sort of international bodies who are responsible for emergency response. There's a network of around 30 established Blue Shield committees which operate on either a national or regional basis. So for example, Blue Shield Pacifica is operating in the Pacific region, and there are 6 committees in preparation, so they're doing the work to establish themselves. In Australia, we have those 4 founding partners represented by the ASA for archives, ALIA for the library sector, Australia ICOMOS, and ICOM Australia. An important part of the work, I think, with Blue Shield Australia, though, is that we also have other participants who bring a great deal of knowledge and sectoral experience and expertise. So AICCM, so the Australian Institute for the Conservation of Cultural Material, is really critical. This is our hands-on conservators who have a lot of experience both in preventative work but also recovery. AMAGA, the Association of Museums and Galleries Australia, Parbika has been involved in prior to establishing a Pacifica committee, and the Federation of Australian Historical Societies. So again, sort of very much those who may hold cultural heritage of different kinds being involved in this work. So our scope is very much about communication and information. So our key sort of areas of endeavour are about risk awareness and disaster preparedness. So making sure people are aware that they have resources and so on. We have done some training and facilitation of disaster preparedness from time to time, but largely we look to facilitate communication and sharing of resources that people can use. And then we try to influence the emergency management and response sector. We're not a body which is a first responder. There are many agencies which take on that role. Ours is about sharing information, facilitating communication, and providing sort of advice and support to those who are the first responders. I thought I would just show you a couple of instances of events, because as I say, in this part of the world, our focus with Blue Shield is much more on preparation for natural disasters, for environmental events, rather than war or conflict of that kind. And the two big ones are probably fire and flood. This just gives you a picture of the impact of these kinds of events. Of course, the most important parts of responding or being prepared for these events are about, you know, people and the community. But cultural heritage, cultural property, archives, records, library materials, museums, local history societies and so on are part of that. So in each of these instances, the sort of role that we took was to gather information, distribute information, make sure resources were available, as in sort of information about how do you recover from fire, what do you do with materials, and so on. And you can see that, you know, this is something that happens almost every year. And the similar sort of thing in floods. So you might think, what are the challenges for us? And I guess I'd like to leave you with some thoughts here before we have some discussion. There are some challenges in actually achieving what we want to. And some of it is about engaging people and stimulating interest in organisations and across our different sectors about being prepared and disaster preparedness and risk assessment. There is a little bit of a challenge in engaging our emergency management agencies and defence agencies in this cultural heritage agenda, because of course the priority focus must be on human life and property. So, you know, there's a challenge to educate about, well, what do we really mean about cultural heritage, and what is it, and where is it, and how will they know it when they see it? Fundraising. So we are a sort of fee membership organisation, and we do have resources that we then use as seed funding. But of course, as with any organisation, you can always do more if you have more money to devote to it. And keeping that balance of what is really an informal network run by volunteers versus a more formal kind of structure. So Blue Shield International gives us some governance parameters, but I think, you know, that sort of balance, as with many professional or voluntary-based organisations is always a bit of a challenge. But I would have to say one of the strengths of Blue Shield is, even though our resources and numbers might be small, there's really a great enthusiasm and a wish to contribute from expertise and skills across all of the different sectors. So that's really all I wanted to say by way of introduction. But I think Kathryn and I might now sort of go into a little bit more detail with some questions about the sorts of things that you know, come up as questions, and then we can look at what is in the Q&A. So I'm just going to stop sharing my, I might just go on to that last one. And of course we can make sure everybody has this afterwards, but this is kind of the where to find more information, and there is a lot of information there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at that point.
Okay, well, I'm going to kick off the questions that we've got, and as Kathryn said, we're going to do a little Q&A with each other, and hopefully we'll cover off on some of your questions, but please feel free to put those questions into the Q&A box as we go along. If there's things that you think of that you want more information on, or you've got queries. Okay, so Kathryn, what actually does the BSA, the Blue Shield Australia, do? We have challenges, we have a vision. What do we actually do?
Yeah, well, apart from meeting regularly, which you and I are involved in, if I can just give a couple of examples about some of those parameters that I talked about. So coordination and facilitating communication and sharing information. One of the most important resources that we have is our website. So if you go and look at the BSA website and the sorts of resources that we have there, we have material that comes from a lot of cultural organisations, from different professional bodies, about things like how do I deal with material, recovering material which is fire affected? How do I put together a disaster plan? So that sort of coordination and sharing of information is really important. So the website is a great resource. We also, you may, follow us on social media, because we will usually track disaster events that are happening, have that communication out there, and also what's happening with responses. So, that's a really key sort of thing. To promote those sort of things more, from time to time we've run seminars. We certainly nominate people to speak at conferences so that we raise that awareness of Blue Shield. And I guess the third thing that I would say is a really key part of our activity is advocating. Now, normally this is via putting in submissions to inquiries, government committees and things of that nature. We're also increasingly aware that we need to have a good amount of solid evidence and information about what has actually happened. So, for example, in 2020, we facilitated a survey on the impact of fire and storm events on GLAM institutions. So trying to build some evidence bases and some research, but then making submissions to different committees. And we do sometimes provide seed funding for activities, which I think I mentioned. So they're sort of generally the areas that we work in. You've been involved with Blue Shield for a little while now. Would you like to comment on some of the things that have been particular to ASA or the archive sector in what we've done?
Thanks. Yes, we've been involved right from the very beginning when BSA was set up under the auspices of the Collections Council, which is almost seems another lifetime ago. But yeah, right from the get-go, archives have been a key pillar in the BSA, either through CARA or through the ASA. I'd have to say that our work has very much, the archive sector has very much participated through sharing communications. So thank you to the ASA for letting us take over the Twitter feed at times, or post things on the ASA Facebook page, or put things up onto the ASA website, just to raise awareness, point people to information or resources, particularly around times of disaster and crisis, when we know that members of the general public are out there looking for information, people are looking for the resources on how to do whatever. I know that from time to time, even in my own personal capacity, I've pointed people at various different resources on the BSA website because they want to know, how do I actually recover this piece of my cultural property, my heritage that has been damaged through the course of a flood? Or they're liaising obviously on behalf of a community organisation that wants to know more about what to do in these kinds of situations. The ASA and the archives sector has participated in a whole range of events that have been held by the BSA. So we've had regular pieces about BSA at our ASA conferences. I spoke in 2015 at our conference about what we were doing at that particular point in time. We've also held disaster planning workshops. We've participated in other people's conferences, sort of raising awareness about BSA and what we're about, and also the importance of disaster preparedness and planning. And one of the key things that Kathryn's touched on is the role of advocating for awareness of protecting cultural property in times of crisis. So we have done an awful lot of submissions over the years. So we've actually most recently put in a submission about the Yukon Gorge tragedy. We've been participating through putting in submissions into the recent Royal Commission on national natural disaster arrangements. I think I've got that correct. We put in submission about the review of the protection of movable cultural heritage in relation to that act when that was happening a couple of years ago. We've been involved in putting submissions into a whole range of different types of government inquiries or requests for information from subject matter experts to raise awareness, to actually put a stake in the ground for BSA that we're here and there's a particular area of interest that is relevant to our communities that we need to raise awareness of with the government. So we've done a lot of those. One of the things that we've also done is looked at the impact of fire and storm events on GLAM institutions in 2020. So last year was not just the year of COVID, it was also the year of natural disaster. So have a look on the BSA website, because you can actually see the results of our survey to find out what actually happened to cultural heritage during this natural disaster year. And obviously using that kind of information helps us when we're actually presenting cases through submissions. So making government more aware with obviously the hard facts and figures of how cultural heritage can be impacted by natural disaster. So that's some of the things we've done in terms of outward facing promotion. Some of the things we've done, which you may remember, is we had a disaster bin competition in the year before COVID. So back in 2019, in that era of normality, we, in conjunction with our May Day campaign, we actually ran a Show Us Your Disaster Bin competition. So to encourage people to be aware of their need to prepare for disasters, to plan for disasters, and to have the necessary equipment on hand, we got a competition up and running about showing us your disaster bin, and that was fantastic. We had a lot of entries, and I think the Tasmanian Museum won with their great video. So that's one thing that we also do. Now we've moved away from having a May Day awareness campaign, and one of the things you would have noticed last year, it was a bit low key because of COVID. This year hopefully will make more of an impact. We have piggybacked onto the UNESCO's coordination day of disaster risk reduction. So on the 13th of October, or in the lead up to the 13th of October, the archives community will be asked to be promoting Disaster Risk Reduction Day and doing the things that you need to do to reduce disaster outcomes. So that's some of the other things that we've been doing. And obviously from time to time, Kathryn and I put articles into Archives Matter, and we also put out our regular updates to you. So, yep. One last thing I need to give a plug here. We actually have started to make some traction with the educational institutions that are running tertiary courses in emergency management. We've developed a bit of a relationship with the University of Newcastle's disaster management course, which is another way of raising awareness, but also teaching the first responders about protecting cultural heritage and the issues that are involved with obviously the salvage and the recovery of cultural heritage in times of disaster. So, yep, lots of different things going on that the archive sector, you may not have seen some of it, but we've definitely been doing a lot behind the scenes. Okay, I have a question for you. So, how can people get involved with the BSA over the next 2 years when the chair of the BSA moves to the archive sector?
So I think the first thing I would say about that, and I'm really pleased to see some of the questions coming through in the Q&A, is to bring your ideas. So as I say, BSA operates generally with the representatives from the member organisations who form a committee that meets and, you know, talks about issues of the time, which might be communication about a particular disaster that is happening, or, you know, making a submission, or, you know, how we relate to the international body. But there's potential to do more and different things if people are willing to be involved. So I guess the first thing is bring your ideas, contribute your ideas. Kathryn and I are very pleased to hear those. And this is a good moment to do that because we've been reviewing our strategic plan. One of the things that the sort of international umbrella organisation is keen to make sure everybody has is a kind of consistent and forward-looking strategic plan. So we've had various things that we have done in the past and that we want to keep doing, but this is a good moment to say, well, where do we want to put that focus on activities in the next couple of years? And there are things that you can do that are not necessarily BSA committee driven, but are very much what can you do in your own backyard. So BSA is always very keen to promote or support or provide seed funding, if that helps, for local activity. So, you know, what's happening in your archives? Do you have an up-to-date disaster plan? Would it help to have a local branch workshop about what various organisations do in terms of disaster preparation? You know, yeah, so campaigns, events, those sorts of things. What can you do which is of interest and of local value? You know, there are lots of ideas about advocacy and capacity building and communication. So, but, you know, what are the ones that really sing for you as members of ASA that you would like to see focus on? And BSA can be a bit of an odd beast because we take in a range of concerns. So, you know, we're often about archives and records, but, you know, we have sometimes quite different concerns, or sometimes very surprisingly common concerns with people who are dealing with heritage buildings or archaeological sites. So it's sort of tying those things together and thinking, well, what do we want to contribute from the archive sector, and where do we want to take this in the next couple of years? So I'd almost say over to you to contribute. I wonder if we might actually look at some of the responding to some of the questions that have come in, because I think that's a really good sort of tie-in with how can you be involved and what would you like to be involved with. There are a couple of questions that relate to whether we work with the Australian Defence Force or how we participate with emergency first responder types of agencies. And they're really good questions. And one of the questioners has made the point that certainly in the UK and the US, there are much closer alliances there and a lot of training that occurs. That's not something that has happened very much in Australia, although we do have a defence contact and the chair of BSA, you know, as time for our contacts permits, has had discussions about what the opportunities are there. We've also had some contacts with Red Cross and with other emergency services agencies. I think this is something that certainly there's an opportunity to do more. And Kathryn, I think, mentioned the emergency training. And I think that's an important point, that we actually don't want to be dealing with these agencies at the sharp end in a crisis. I was talking to someone who is involved with the SES yesterday, and that was the very point she was making. You know, at that point, that's not when we need help or advice or assistance. We actually need it beforehand. So I think our focus needs to be on sort of building understanding and capacity now for the event that will happen next year or the year after. Yeah, so it is a good point, and it's not something that has gained much traction despite some attempts to open this up. So I think it's just something that we need to keep advocating for. Do you want to say anything, Kathryn?
Jump in. Yeah, I was going to jump in. Before Australia entered the Iraq conflict, many years ago, there was actually a meeting of cultural heritage leaders at that time, and discussions about what needed to happen in terms of protecting cultural heritage as part of the Australian Defence Force's mission in Iraq. I know because I actually participated in a couple of those early discussions about preparing information and providing information to Defence at that particular point in time. So it was definitely on the mind of the Australian Defence Forces back in the early 2000s. I was also going to add that in 2018, Blue Shield Australia held a symposium in Canberra, and it wasn't just a Blue Shield talking to Blue Shield. We opened it up to a lot of emergency organisations and the Australian government, and it was a great opportunity to network and start to build those relationships with the government about the issues that Blue Shield is advocating for. So ratifying the protocols of the Hague Convention, being more across the need to protect cultural heritage when Australia gets involved in, say, for instance, a peacekeeping operation somewhere, or is involved in disaster recovery. So, for instance, when we send our forces offshore to help with someone else's natural disaster, but also how they can assist when they're dealing with natural disaster in Australia. So that symposium was a fantastic opportunity. It definitely has opened doors, and from a Blue Shield perspective, we're definitely starting to see a lot more communication coming from the government to Blue Shield, asking us questions about various different things and asking us to contribute to surveys and other matters, so they can obviously gain a much broader perspective about our interests and our advocacy in this area. So I think it's a softly, but we are taking some steps and we are starting to build those relationships. And I think it's just a case of we just keep chipping away at it. And I think putting the submissions into royal commissions, putting submissions into government inquiries or requests for information is another really important way of getting our message heard and getting us on people's radars.
Yeah. I might just comment on another question that has come through about the Torrens Resilience Institute in relation to that, because yes, we are aware, and they were a really valuable participant. There's the puppy. We're just removing the dog. who is barking
Oh,
at the
there you go.
wind. All right. Yes, they were a very valuable participant in that summit that Kathryn mentioned a couple of years ago. But can we see the puppy? Yes. But the other point there was, do we have an emergency management sector rep on the committee? No, we don't. And that's a really good idea. And I think a great way of building some of those connections. So I just wanted to pick that one up at the same time, being a bit along the same lines. I noticed there was a question about Jukung Gorge and the Jabwarung trees. I think Kathryn mentioned this. We did actually coordinate with some of our member organisations a submission on the Senate committee inquiry. It's not quite, it's not straight down the line archival heritage, but it is certainly something that comes under the ambit of Blue Shield. And I think, in fact, the archive sector involvement in putting that submission together was really highly valued.
Yes.
But, ICOMOS, Monuments and Sites, certainly has a lot of connections into built heritage, but also archaeological sites. So yes, this is part of the territory. I am just having a quick look at other questions. Oh, particular instruments of the convention that haven't been ratified. We can certainly make sure that that information is available. I'm not sure that without the documents in front of me, I'd want to talk too much about them, but certainly the second protocol is the one that goes into more detail about emergency situations, crisis situations, and actually talks about the way that response can occur. UNESCO actually has all of these documents, and if you look at the Blue Shield International website, they have links to the kind of the documents which sit underneath Blue Shield's work. And maybe that's one that we can send some information about. Maybe we can do a little article for Archives Matters about, what's the foundation for Blue Shield work. If that's okay, rather than me spouting something that ends up being not quite right, or,
And the protocols also deal with the repatriation of stolen cultural property and prosecution of theft of cultural property. So they're quite weighty protocols, and there has been a lot of representation to the Australian government about ratifying these protocols, and I'm not quite sure why it's taking so long, but there's some promising signs, and hopefully we can get this moving. It was definitely also raised as part of the review of the review of the Act concerning movable cultural heritage, because of the potential that Australian heritage could end up overseas and we would be in a very difficult position to try and recover it. And one of the examples that the ASA pointed to at that time was the Fairfax Archives, photographic archive, which had ended up in the United States and was at very, very much at risk of being lost forever. So that submission should be up on the ASA website. I can definitely make sure and check with James that it is up there so you can see what we said in relation to the review of the Movable Cultural Heritage Act. But as Kathryn pointed out, we can make the protocol information about the protocols available, and definitely it's one we're going to keep working at. But I think it has huge ramifications in terms of how the Australian government would actually have to undertake certain actions if required. So it's not just a yes, that's a great idea, let's sign up to it, but it's in the implementation.
Yeah, and we certainly have had opportunity to provide input to government from our perspective about implementation actions that might fit within the sort of the convention and the protocols. But I think it's a work in progress to actually move towards ratification. Yeah. There are a couple of questions which relate to the recent disastrous fire at the University of Cape Town. Just, you know, what are the benefits of a global alliance in that sort of situation, and what would happen if a similar thing happened here? You know, what would Blue Shield do? I mean, I think if I just take that first part, the global alliance, it does mean that there's more of a flow of information. So this is, I think, why Blue Shield International and why we have tried to encourage other Blue Shield committees, establishing something locally which brings together the organisations that are concerned with cultural property of various kinds, is really important, because that then means that things can happen on the ground. But I suppose the international part is really about sort of finding out what's happening, and if there's a need for response in any kind and that sort of thing, to actually facilitate that. If it happened here, which it kind of has, although maybe not quite the exact example, but certainly fire has been a significant disaster for many parts of Australia, and many, you know, cultural collections of this kind. The first thing that we always try and do is make sure that there's an information flow. So through our professional associations who may have contact with people on the ground, you know, what's happening, what can we do to facilitate communication, what resources do we have, as in, you know, educational types of resources that may help. A lot of what we do is actually just making people aware of these sorts of things, because the more that people know that these disasters happen and the impact they have, the easier it is for us to make arguments about how important it is to have awareness and education and preparedness. So, you know, it's a terrible way of doing it, but the more you have that disaster, the more impetus and motivation there is for people to do something to prevent it happening again. Don't know if you've got comments too, Kathryn.
Well, I remember the Victorian bushfires, and they were an incredible tragedy for many, many people, as well as a huge loss of cultural heritage at the time. One of the things that some of the archives did at the time was actually go through their collections and provide copies of relevant documents, or in the case of the National Film and Sound Archive, actually provided copies of the different travel docos that had been filmed in the 1930s around these areas. So whilst the cultural heritage had been lost due to fire, there was activity undertaken and to actually provide copies of what some of what may have been lost. And I've noticed that that is also happening at the moment with Cape Town. But I think you're right, it's a case of nothing focuses the mind like a disaster, and the fact that it can happen to any of our organisations, to any of our personal cultural heritage as well. And what are the things we need to do to put in place the appropriate preparations to mitigate and to minimise as much as possible these kinds of disasters. So I think, unfortunately, we have to use some of these events to actually raise awareness and make people focus in on what we need to do.
Yeah.
So I think James, is that? Yep, James has actually just posted in the chat. You can about finding the ASA submissions on the review of movable cultural heritage and the Yukon Gorge statement that was made to the Parliament. So.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about seed funding?
Seed funding, yes. So the sorts of things that BSA has provided funding for in the past have been some disaster preparedness workshops that were run through a number of states. So that was, you know, sort of contracted and delivered. We've also provided money for local seminars. And until COVID, we were providing something to the Federation of Australian Historical Societies about doing some work across the range of historical societies, but unfortunately that had to be deferred. We're open to proposals, I guess is the main message. So we meet every couple of months. We just need to have a sort of a proposal about what the activity is, what the benefit will be, how it relates to Blue Shield objectives, and what the budget is, and we will consider it. I'd really encourage things like local workshops and seminars, where you might want to look at disaster risk, you might want to look at actual response and recovery sorts of things that might be geared towards particular materials. We tend to prefer seed funding, so something where there's some commitment from the organisation that is putting the activity together. So, you know, you'll always have a better, as with any funding thing, you'll always have a better chance if you're willing to put some component in, and we provide some of the sort of matching funding. Yeah.
And I was just going to reiterate, from July this year, the archive sector will actually be chairing the Blue Shield Australia. So for the next 2 years, Kathryn Dan will be chairing Blue Shield Australia. So this is a great opportunity for the archives sector to be involved with Blue Shield, but also to put up your suggestions so that we can actually really have a great 2 years of chairing the Blue Shield.
Yeah. We've got another question in about national database of heritage or collections lost in Australia, or is it data held by separate agencies at a state level? So in around, I think, 2015, Blue Shield was sponsoring some work to try and gather this information. I have to say, as with a lot of surveys, I don't think we got the fullest response that we wanted. So this sort of information is actually very scattered. And, you know, there's potential for a good piece of work. And it's scattered for 2 reasons. I think because we're dealing with different sectors, and then actually the difficulty in gaining contributions to this kind of database. So for instance, you know, there are heritage registers which relate more to built heritage. They exist at a state level. They tend to be quite different in the information that they hold. You know, they're not all brought together necessarily. So there's that kind of issue. But, you know, there is a somewhat of a framework there that Blue Shield started a few years ago, and maybe it could be reinstituted with some enthusiastic people who would like to promote it.
And I will say that the survey that was done last year was extremely helpful in understanding this, at least the scope of the damage that had been done and the magnitude of that. So yeah, if anybody's keen looking for a project, get in contact. Have we got any other questions?
Someone has said, did the puppy wake up the kittens? So if you don't know, Kathryn Robinson has 2 very beautiful Burmese kittens who we think they're asleep. Are they still asleep?
They are absolutely crashed out.
They're asleep.
Sorry, guys. It's like waking up sleeping babies. You don't wake up sleeping kittens. leave them be. Otherwise, we will have kitten magic. And trust me, sometimes that's a little bit too difficult.
And I think the puppy is outside wandering.
Okay. Oh, we do have another question here. Are threats to cultural heritage included in national and international discussions on climate change? I think they are.
Yeah.
In the short answer, I think the ramifications are definitely of climate change are definitely starting to be included in terms of cultural heritage, or cultural heritage included in the discussions on climate change. That the reality is this is going to impact everything of our lives, every aspect of our lives.
And certainly it's something that I think, various researchers and the professional bodies themselves are starting to look at as, what do we know about how climate change will impact on collections? Blue Shield, I don't know if sponsored is the right word, but certainly encouraged or suggested a piece of work, a student project at Bond University dealing with actuarial students actually to look at heritage locations and rise of sea levels predicted due to climate change. So, I mean, that's a small piece of work. It's available from our website, but it's I think indicative of the kind of work that now needs to be done to work out, well, what are the climate change factors? What are the things that we expect to happen? Fire, flood, storm events, and what's the likely impact? And it kind of matches with that earlier question about do we know where the heritage material is, and do we know what's happened to it? Yeah. So,
sorry.
Good.
I think we might wrap it here because it's 4 minutes to 2, and I know most people have to venture off. But I did want to thank you both it's been a really interesting and engaging presentation on Blue Shield Australia and all its activities and how it operates and how people can get involved. I think there's so much more to it than people kind of realize on the face of it. So I hope it really encourages our ASA members and potentially others across GLAM to consider engaging with Blue Shield Australia and yourselves, particularly while we have the opportunity to be a leader in Blue Shield Australia over the coming few years. So yeah, I hope that that's something we can really help with the mission of that communications and awareness that you mentioned. Maybe we can put forward some workshop and seminar ideas and see if we can make it possible. But I encourage everyone to follow the Blue Shield Australia accounts that Kathryn put up at the end of her presentation. We can also share those when we put out the recording and all of that. So we'll make it really accessible for everyone to join. But thank you both. That was really great. I think we might have one question left, which
I was going to tackle that one.
You go for it.
Okay. You know what? I think it's a great win, not just a big win, but a great win would be to actually have a great win for Blue Shield would be to have that awareness in the broader community that we exist, that we're a single source of truth in terms of come to our website. We will point you to the appropriate resources when you need them, but we would also hope that you come and visit us from time to time to find out what to do to prepare for a disaster. So I think that would be a great win for BSA is if we became much more visible to the wider community, not just, oh, you're that person that's on that committee. What do I need to do for a disaster that's about to happen in my area? But actually that sort of, we do have that visibility in the broader community. I think that would be a great win for us. And that's something I think we'll both of us will be working very hard to try and make happen over the next 2 years.
Yep, well said.
Thank you so much. I think that was a great ending and gives us all
Thank
a
you.
nice goal to move forward with as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
See you.